Let me introduce our panelist, Christine Ziccarelli from the American First Policy Institute, RISI, Nicola Monti from the Immigration Demography Observatory, Paris, and Steve Camurato for the Center for Immigration Studies. And in general, panel will talk about mainly the demographic and other consequences of mass illegal immigration, both in the United States and Europe. And first, I would like to ask Steve to evaluate a little bit the situation. One of the biggest migration phenomenon of the United States, because millions of people are on the move, but surprisingly not into the United States, but now out of the United States.
Well, that's true. That's true. Anyway, I'm going to go from this. You don't have to look at it because my comments too should be able to give you a sense. But anyway, so I just have this first slide, and I wanted to just briefly go over some of the things. I think it's important to recognize that the wave of migration that the United States experienced was certainly unprecedented, and I'm going to show you some stuff to show that. But it was not caused by some fundamental change in the sending regions. But what I do think it's important to understand caused it, other than the Biden administration's policies, I do think it's important to understand that one of the things that caused it was just the enormous size of the immigrant population already in the United States, right? Once you have tens of millions of people in your country from other countries, this creates the social networks that then help drive migration, and you're not going to be able to have that kind of mass immigration, or at least in the American context, unless you already had a large population. So once you get to 40 million, 45 million foreign-born people in the United States, then it's going to draw in a lot more. Or should I say, there's going to be tremendous pressure, and that's important. Now, there were other things that happened as well that really aren't the Biden administration's fault. We've actually mentioned them, so I won't go over them much here, but there were things that made our border very hard to control, including a policy that reflected partly the Flores decision and then expansion of that, legislation on trafficking of minors and things like that, that just made it, in court rulings, that made it hard to detain and hold people and tended to cause a lot of make it hard to control the border. Not impossible, as we'll see. But nonetheless, the Biden administration came in, and I think the important thing to understand, and where we see a real clear analogy with Europe and Angela Merkel's statements about refugees, the Biden administration, even before it took office, said that they were going to deprioritize enforcement. They made a series of statements about releasing people. So before, things started to queue up in Mexico, even before Biden took office. And those statements are not technically policy, but they're incredibly important, just like they've been important, were important in the context of Germany and the migration crisis Merkel created. Okay, then the Biden administration did do a whole bunch of things. In addition to public statements, they ended that Remain in Mexico program that asked some fraction of people to wait in Mexico for their asylum applications. They decided to release virtually everyone at the border, and not just unaccompanied minors, but family units and even individuals. They used a policy in the United States called parole, partly to do this, and they did it on a scale heretofore unknown, right? So we think they may have released into the United States 5 million people, and millions more crossed surreptitiously. So the surge was, unprecedented. They even flew lots of people in under a special program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, and that was like nearly 250,000 people. These were all, let me be clear, inadmissible aliens who they still allowed in because they made an appointment with this app, the CBP-1 app, and then they flew them in, and then they released them in the United States, and then, in many cases, they gave them work authorization. Now, most people still count them as illegal immigrants, but that should give you pause. If we let somebody into the United States and give them work authorization, are they really an illegal immigrant? You could say, well, no, they have kind of a legal status. So that is one of the things that happened. And finally, always remember that once the asylum system in any country, including the United States, becomes overwhelmed, it just encourages ever more people to apply in the hope that they too will be allowed to stay, that they too will be eventually released, that they too will get work authorization. So an overwhelmed asylum system is what was created very quickly. So now there's like more than 1 million people in the queue now. And that draws ever more people in. Now, in a nutshell, as I say here in this slide, what did Trump do to stop this flow? He just reversed all those policies in a nutshell. He did some other things. The biggest things were public statements, again, that the law was back in business. He didn't release, they're not releasing people at the border. They're not even taking most asylum claims at the border. They just reversed it. Obviously, they ended the special program, the CHNV program for those countries I mentioned. So they did all that. And if we go to some of the other slides, you'll just see some of the consequences. But first, I just wanted to show you what the Census Bureau says net migration into the United States was. And that's just that figure 2. So this is the difference between the number of people coming and going. So the number of people actually coming is bigger than this. But this is the way in which the Bureau measures migration. And what you can see is 2.8 million in 2024. And that represents migration mid-2023 to mid-2024. But what you're supposed to get out of this is that what happened in the Biden years was completely unprecedented. You could go back decades and never find anything like this. Immigration, net migration ran between 1 and 1.5 million to the United States at most, more like 1 to 1.2 million. And the Biden administration just blew that up to almost 3 million. So you could say nearly tripled it, measured this way. Let's oh shoot, this is maybe not stapled right. Anyway, let's go to the slide that looks like this one here on border apprehensions. And it says figure 1 in mine. In any event, what it shows is that border apprehensions, even before Biden took office, were running at about 90,000 a year, a little more than that. And then they blew it up. It's got to nearly 400,000 a year. I mean, a month. I'm sorry. Did I say month? Yeah, 400,000 a month they were encountering. So it went spectacularly up. The big drop in 2024 partly reflects they just started flying more people in. Partly they asked Mexico to do more, and you did get a drop. It still remained incredibly high. And then you can see what happened in the green line under Trump. You get this massive decline. So basically, border apprehensions went from nearly 400,000 down to more like 26,000 a month. So there's still people coming. There's still people. This is all borders, north borders, southern borders, everywhere. People who are presenting themselves at ports of entry. So this is the broadest measure of border apprehensions, but it's spectacularly down. So why does this matter? Because there is this argument in the United States, and I assume it's in Western Europe, but that migration is like the weather. It's not really something you can manage. People come. You hear people say, economics or markets laugh at borders. That migration is this force of nature that you can't really resist. But what this kind of analysis shows is that's just a crock. Of course, if you change policy, you can have a huge impact. If you look at, just because I like this figure, I thought I'd put it in. This one just shows what happened under the various presidents, the last 4 administrations. Basically, what you had is essentially, as you can see here, immigration was about 7.9 million total, and that's the growth in the foreign-born. So that's a net number that actually takes into account all the people who leave and deaths, which is about 300,000 a year among the foreign-born. And yet it grew by almost 8 million in the 12 years before Biden, and it grew by 8.3 million in Biden's 4 years. So to give you an idea of just how enormous this influx was. And if you go to the next slide, should say slide number 4, it just gives you an idea of the history of immigration to the United States. So even before Biden, you can see that immigration was already very high. We still had a lot of, in 2010, there were 40 million foreign-born in the United States. They made up almost 13% of the population. So we were getting near the record, but then when Biden supercharged immigration, it reached in January of this year almost 16 million. That's the way you read this 15.8 million. So extraordinary, 53.3 million, an 8.3 million increase compared to when he took office. Just unbelievable. Now, not all of that was illegal. It looks like somewhere around 75% of it was a growth in the illegal population. I should say, I'm sorry, 70% is more right. So, but it's not all illegal. So we have lots of legal immigration, and legal immigration picked up after COVID. But the point is, the surge was just without any precedent. And it put America where it's never been before. This is the highest foreign-born percentage ever recorded in American history, as you can see from that chart. Even during the last Great Wave, which you might date from 1870 to 1920, the foreign-born share never reached 15.8%. So we are now in uncharted territory on immigration. But what goes up sometimes does come down. So if you look at this figure here, you can just see what happened under President Trump. It's the one that shows, it's figure 5. It just shows that it hit 53.3 million, but now it's down to about 51.1 million. So a 2.2 million decline in 6 months. This is data from July, of this year, but we have the foreign-born through August. We don't have any newer data because of the government shutdown. It's about the same in August. So the data fluctuates. It's based on a monthly survey called the Current Population Survey. It's assumed to be pretty accurate, and it shows a drop-off in the foreign-born, the likes of which we've never seen. We've been collecting this data for well over 30 years. It's never declined this much, this fast. Something fundamentally changed. And let me show you in this next figure, figure 6, kind of shows you, this is the one that just looks at people from Latin America who arrived in 1980 or later and are not U.S. citizens. And we pick up millions of those people, and they tend to be pretty overwhelmingly illegal immigrants in the data. So yes, it includes both legal and illegal immigrants. And that number was about 17 million in December of 2024. And since Trump has taken office, it's fallen spectacularly, which means this drop-off of 2.2 million looks to be overwhelmingly illegal immigrants. And finally, I know I just do too many of these charts, but 2 minutes. Okay, good. So you can see in the last figure, just shows you my estimate of illegal immigration. So this is the total illegal population. It takes into account all the people who come, all the people who go, all the people who die, all the people who legalize. Remember, in America, those categories, you move between categories. You have a temporary worker who might get a green card, become a permanent resident. You have people who are illegal immigrants who get green cards. They get asylum. They marry an American. There's a lot of ways illegal immigrants move out of illegal status. And what, as far as I could tell, the illegal population seems to have declined by about 1.6 million in Trump's term, at least through the first 6 months. Again, there's nothing in the data that suggests anything like that's ever happened. So it turns out that policy matters. Immigration is not like the weather. It can be changed. The impact of this immigration is huge on America, right? I could go through a bunch of statistics, but we're at the point where 1/3 of all the children in poverty in America today are in an immigrant family or the child of an immigrant. That's a big number. We're at the point where we're approaching 25% of all the children in America have immigrant parents. Now, again, and as was true of the poverty statistic, most of those people are U.S. born. But still, these are enormous impacts on schools, on social services. I'll just give you one of my favorite statistics. As far as we can tell from both the current population survey and the survey of income and program participation, more than half of all immigrant households in the United States access one of our big welfare programs. So there's a lot of implications for taxpayers, schools, hospitals. So it's worth thinking about. I just like this statistic. In Minnesota, just because I like to pick that state, just because it's the impact state, more than 40% of all the children in poverty in the state of Minnesota now, a state which traditionally had very low poverty, are the children of immigrants. In a very real sense, a regular old upper Midwest state now has a poverty problem that it never had before because of our immigration system. And that kind of thing is repeated in many cities and states across the country. Thank you. I hope I didn't go over.
Thank you, Steve. So now we move to Nicola to speak a little bit about a very special problem, which is, or let's say, challenge, which is a challenge for Europe and currently not for the United States.
Thank you very much, Victor. Once again, I'd like to thank our American friends from the International Network for Immigration Research. Our organization had the privilege to host the previous edition of this annual conference in Paris 1 year ago, and I'm very glad to be here in DC today. It falls down to me, indeed, to speak about an issue that is probably more relevant to the European situation so far than to the American situation, and that is the issue of large-scale immigration from the Muslim world, which has come to prominence in France and in many, at least Western European countries, as the number one issue in politics now. As you may already know, France now has the largest Muslim population in Europe. In a few decades, a religion which had virtually no followers in France at all, rose to prominence as the second most important religion in the country. And actually, perhaps already the first one among the youngest people, if you think in terms of actual religious practice. And this is entirely due to immigration. There is no such thing as a native Islam in France. Official and reliable data on religion and ethnicity are quite rare in France because of a very constrained legal framework, yet they do exist. We know that 44% of all immigrants living in France declare themselves to be Muslims, as it is the case for 32% of second-generation descendants of immigrants in France, as opposed to barely 1% of people who are neither immigrants nor children of immigrants. And among this 1%, most of them are actually third-generation descendants from the earliest immigrants from North Africa who settled in France in the 1960s or 70s. So, of course, this percentage varies a lot according to the geographical origins. You get something like 90% of immigrants from Algeria, Morocco, or Tunisia who declare themselves to be Muslims. Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia being the countries which have the most residence permits in France today. You also have a significant number of Muslims who come from the Muslim part of sub-Saharan Africa, so Guinea, Senegal, Mali, etc. A small part, a tiny part actually, of these immigrant groups may come from other religions. So this is the case, for example, of Middle Eastern Christians, but they are statistically quite insignificant. So immigration plays what can only be described as a central role in the rise of Islam in France. And it does so by three, I would say, correlated factors. The first one is immigration itself, the new incoming flows. The second one is what we could call the differentiated birth rates of Muslim immigrants in France. And the third one is the greater religious transmission within Muslim immigrant households as compared to other households. Let's start by the first initial factor, which is, of course, immigration itself. Along with the UK, France was one of the very few European countries to experience mass non-European immigration starting in the 1960s by what was mostly a temporary work immigration at that time. Then family reunification policies were put into place in the late 1970s, which changed both the scale and nature of immigration in our countries. And since the late 1990s, we have entered a new phase in our immigration history, which is a time of old records. If you take a look only at legal immigration, the yearly number of first residence permits granted every year by France has tripled over the last 25 years. And if we take a look at the countries of origin of these immigrants, we can see that 2/3 of these newly granted residence permits are granted to people who come from Muslim majority countries. So once again, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, sub-Saharan countries. France alone actually grants 2/3 of all first-time residence permits granted to Algerians in the European Union, but there are not only Algerians, of course. Then there's also the growing issue of asylum that was discussed earlier on. The most common nationality among both asylum seekers and actual refugees in France is Afghanistan. So this is a kind of Muslim immigration that we haven't had for a long time. It really started rising over the last 15 years. The second driving force I just mentioned is the differentiated fertility rate. it is measured in France that on average the fertility rate of immigrant women born in North Africa is 50% higher than that of native French women. The fertility rate of immigrant women from sub-Saharan Africa in France is double that of native women. To a large extent, of course, these higher fertility rates, they come from the stems and customs of their countries of origin. If you take a look at the 6 countries in the world which have the highest fertility rates now, actually 5 out of 6 are French-speaking African countries. So we know that the peak of in birth from migrant women also occurs in the very first year after they settled in France for several reasons. But this is not a French exception to a large extent, because if you take a look at Pew Research Center data on Muslim population in France, they were able to measure that on average Muslim women in Europe have 1 more child than the rest of women living in Europe. And perhaps more quickly, the third driving force is the stronger religious transmission within Muslim immigrant families. We know that 91% of people brought up in Muslim families in France continue to claim their parents' religion, as opposed to only 67% of people who grew up in a Catholic household. The reasons for Islam being more resilient to secularization are, of course, numerous and various. In the Western world in general, as you know, Christianity has known quite a relative decline over at least the last century due to several factors: urbanization, economics, a change in values, etc. Islam has not been following the same path at all. On the contrary, in its native bands, homeland in the Muslim world, strictly speaking, it seems to have taken on a new social importance over the last decades, after the parenthesis that was opened by European colonization and then the rise of the first post-independence regimes, which tended to be more secular than today's regimes. So Muslim populations in France seem to be part of this global trend in the I would say, in the reaffirmation of Islam as a structuring political and social force where Muslims live in numbers. I would also like to insist that beyond these numbers only, this rise in immigration also has an impact about, I would say, the qualitative aspects of Islam in France, that is to say, the types of Islam that are practiced in our country, which tends to become more orthodox, more radical, one might say. One of the most visible aspects of it, and one on which the French political debate has focused a lot over the last decades, is that of hijab, of the Islamic scarf. The share of Muslim women wearing hijab in France has risen by half over the last 10 years. So there's growing pressure within Muslim communities in France to show the most visible aspects of Orthodox Islamic practice. And this rising immigration has also consolidated what can be considered as the weaponization of Islam by some of the countries of origin. The most typical case is perhaps the Grand Mosque of Paris, which is legitimately considered as some sort of second Algerian embassy in Paris. The Grand Mosque is absolutely controlled by the Algerian regime. There are other Muslim organizations in France which are controlled by the Kingdom of Morocco. I would say the case of Turkish Islam is probably the most striking of it all, because Turkey has its own state-funded imams sent to the countries in which there are Turkish diasporas in Europe. They do respond to the Department of Religious Affairs in Ankara. There are something like 300 Turkish mosques in France which have Turkish state imams. So yes, of course, this is also a matter of sovereignty, a matter of political concern. I'll stop there in order to have Christian have her turn. But you can understand, of course, that all this being said, the issue of Muslim immigration is the one which has played the most important role in the rising awareness about immigration crisis in France, because it forces French society to rethink many of its structuring fundamentals. I mean, if you take a look at the very French concept of laïcité, state secularism, not only separation between church and state, but also the idea that religion belongs into the private sphere. This was all conceived in the context of a struggle between the Catholic Church on one end and the secular republic on the other end. Now Islam comes. Islam comes with I would say, its conception of politics being tied to religion. And this also plays a role, in fact, in the fact that many former left-wingers, for example, in France, whether in the intellectual life or in politics, tend to be more and more critical of mass immigration because they have the feeling that the kind of immigration we have is not only threatening French traditional identity, but it's also threatening, contemporary France's liberal values. And well, this is more topical than ever. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Nicola. And we'll just continue the topic with Christian about the effects of mass immigration to Europe, about national identities. So.
Yeah, it's a perfect transition. So thank you both. Actually, it's really great to be here, and especially with us at the America First Policy Institute, we're very interested in these questions of not just immigration, but the sort of entire civilizational battle that I think is really central here. So this is what, if you're not familiar with it, this is what AFPI's Civilizational Action Project has actually been trying to get at. I've been over to Europe a few different times this year, and my team has really been trying to investigate these matters as kind of these answers to a bigger question, right? So I really think that the rise of the America First movement in the U.S. has ushered in this new moment, or this new paradigm even, of raising the civilizational issue and question to a priority. And so we're done with just debating policy. We're confronting the conditions of a civilization and having a full force 21st style reckoning, which I think has been brought on mostly by immigration. That's the main thing that's really forced us to this reckoning that we're seeing. And so both in the Biden administration in the US and for about a decade in Europe since Merkel opened the gates in 2015, we're seeing this mass flow of immigrants from culturally distant nations. And unfortunately, there's been obviously terrible, devastating consequences with innocent citizens, at the worst, getting murdered or assaulted, and otherwise just people feeling displaced in their own communities, which is really tragic. But I think the reason why this is happening, even though despite the consequences being so severe, is that the leftist elites and the left in general sees the answer to the civilizational question completely different than the way that we might answer it here in this room. And so they see the culture that sort of built the civilization and they disdain it, right? And so they make sort of claims that we should go back on everything that we believe in. They have this, what intellectuals call in the movement, the oikophobia, so the fear of one's own home, and they seek to perpetuate that throughout society. And so I think what's really interesting, what's been happening in Europe the past few years, is that ordinary citizens are now finding that it's actually in their interest to sort of stand up against this. And it's because they're seeing the changes happen directly in their own home, and they're very uncomfortable with it, and they're really looking to new movements and new ideas for solutions in this. So basically, I think what's the essence of that is that they're realizing that instead of wanting to demonize their home, they're realizing that they have a home. And so the citizens that are hit hardest by the demographic change, particularly in their communities, are seeing now that their home is indeed distinct and that it has been altered and that it also very much must be restored. And it's also because their very inheritance is under attack. So we're seeing that the way I like to think about it is that there's two big buckets that these attacks come in. One is leftism, which is like the umbrella term for all the sort of cultural wars and other forces that seek to dismantle the traditions, the cultures, the values, the faith. The other one is Islam, so it's leftism and Islam. And it reminds me of what historian Arnold Toynbee said about civilizations and the way they die. He said it's not by murder, it's by suicide. But I actually think that it's both in this case. So it's suicide indeed because we're wanting to erase what made us great. And then it's murder because we're letting in these people that literally hate us and have no sort of respect for the host countries that serve them. So just to give you a bit of insight into this specifically, my team was in the UK. We were in London a few weeks ago. And I just want to give you some stats and some information on the situation in the UK, because I think maybe aside from France, it's probably the worst, if not the worst, one of the worst, in Europe right now. So in the UK, there is 30% of the population in Birmingham are Islamic migrants. We have similar stats, 30 to 40% in parts of London, so East Tower hamlets. Other areas like Luton, there are Sharia courts. There's probably around 80 to 90 courts that govern basically in complete parallel societies from the British ordered liberty and rule of law that we know. Matt Goodwin, who is a very prominent speaker on this topic in the UK, has predicted that in 2063, non-white Britons will be a minority, and then by 2160, 2,100, I guess, 1/5 of the population of Britain will be Muslim, and the white British will only be a third. We know that the story of the one Ethiopian alien who was released by the British authorities after committing a pretty heinous sexual assault and then roamed the streets of London for at least 2 days and then asked the British government to be taken into custody and was basically ignored. That has been one of the most recent, I think, worst instances of sort of the entire liberal elite's disconnect and neglect of the citizens that they are meant to serve. And so the UK is pretty bleak, and we're very much wishing our friends that wish to return or to stop this. We're wishing them well because it's not looking good. And I've talked with ordinary Britons too, right? Like the things that they see is they're protesting not out of hate of other cultures, but they're protesting out of love for their own land. And it's actually very encouraging to see these movements rise up, because I think they're definitely the way that we push past this. But like I said, I've spoken a bit about Europe when I've seen this year, but I want to bring this also back, obviously, to the U.S. and what our president and vice president are also getting at with this bigger civilizational battle. And so, to quote J.D. Vance in the infamous Munich Security Conference speech, he said, where's the quote? Sorry, he said, "We've heard a lot about what you need to defend yourselves from, but less about what you're defending yourselves for." And I think that's sort of the question of the civilization, right? It's like, who are we and what are we defending ourselves for? And so when J.D. Vance and Trump, what their strategy, I think, is that they're tying civic nationalism to national security, to national identity, and also, very importantly, to first principles. And so to answer the questions, we have to return to the first things, and that is the question of what the nation is. And so the nation, people have been talking about this more on the new right, especially the NatCon spaces, which is also, like I said, very encouraging, because really what the nation, I think, is it's people held together by bonds, not contracts. So it's bonds, and it's really love that binds them together, because that is what forges the sense of duty and care, and it's what orders our affections rightly towards one another. So from the love of even your family, it grows to your community, and to, from there, your patriotic love of nation. And none of this is to be demonized when it's exercised in a non-extreme way. And so the right ordering of this love, I think, doesn't seek domination or imposition on other cultures or ways of life. It seeks to preserve one's own civilization and culture. And I think it's even very relatable and funny to observe this in our own selves, because people talk about their hometown, whether it's a huge metropolis like Paris that everyone visits, or it's Minnesota, I guess, or somewhere small. You don't love it because it's objectively good. You love it because it's yours. And I think that's a very important part of this reckoning that we're seeing all over the West. And unfortunately, even within, I would say, the right, there are people that see the nation not like this. They see it as merely an economic zone. And this is how you get these situations. One of the reasons you get mass migration, because people see it as a way to sort of make up for economic solutions, I guess. But even on their own terms, it doesn't work, because, like as Steve mentioned, the illegal immigration does not solve economic problems. It actually can create many more, especially in the instances of welfare. And so I think, to kind of close out here, the America First approach is very applicable to the other nations of the West that are experiencing similar issues, but not just in the actual policies, but also in the sort of mentality that we have right now. And so the policies like border security and mass deportations, and even President Trump's declaring English as the official language. I feel like the government of Italy has had some really good policies to do with civic education, and that's really encouraging to see nations wanting to stand up for their values and to teach their children what made their nation great and teach them to love their nation. But I think it's also important to mention that the America First mandate, policy-wise, could never have been fulfilled if the Trump administration weren't so courageous and dead set on this idea of, like, you can just do things. And it's that sort of attitude that needs to prevail to go up against the left, because I think the culture or sort of the secularization, certainly, and also just the advancement of the left is very, very significant in Europe, and it's something that can't, we have to fight back against it. And so I think, just to, like I said, to close out for the second time, the first question of governance that the mass migration situation has forced us to reckon with is, well, who does the government serve? The government should serve the citizens first. Of course, that will look different nation by nation, but ultimately I think that's the essence of the question. And so when people throw around the term, the question, what is America first? What is America? And I think the founders help us answer that. If you look back to John Adams, it's a pretty well-known quote, but he said, he talked about the Constitution, and he said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. A lot of people know that quote, but I think it's important to mention how this idea has also stayed consistent throughout the ideas or the founding fathers and also throughout the American thought leaders in the 19th and 20th century. So if you ever read President Coolidge's 150th anniversary speech honoring the Declaration of Independence, he makes an interesting insight. He says, there were a people, he's talking about the founding fathers here. He says, there were a people who came under the influence of a great spiritual development and acquired a great moral power. No other theory is adequate to explain or comprehend the Declaration of Independence. So I think with John Adams, he's also making a very interesting point, is that he's tying the nation to its people. And so the question of who is America or what is America, the answer is it's the people. And I would say that's also true for our Western allies. And unless the civilizational reckoning that we're experiencing now responds with the rising up to defend the people, there might not be any going back. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The questions from the moderator. So, Steve, I don't understand, that you are the nation of immigrants. So why don't you want more people to come in? Mainly if we have a look at your fertility rate, So it's a common sense that it can be a good solution to importing more people, to balance the problems of, elderly persons, etc., and low fertility.
Right, so we at the center, but many others have looked at this question, and it turns out that at least in the American context, though I can't speak to Europe, immigration has very little impact on population aging, and that is generally the consensus of all demographers. So overall in the United States, if the total fertility rate, the number of children a woman would be expected to have in her lifetime, is now maybe around 1.6, that's for, say, the native-born. If you put in the immigrants, it brings it up to 1.65. So somewhere around 4% increase in overall fertility. Immigration can conceivably, over a 50-year period, offset, depending on how you calculate it, somewhere around 10% of the population aging that would otherwise occur, and that's for several obvious reasons. In America, the immigrants do have more children, but not that many more. And in the second generation in the United States, Hispanics and Asians have exactly the same fertility of whites and black Americans. There's no difference. So you don't have a multiple generation of high fertility, at least in the United States. Middle Easterners, I'll say one thing about Middle Easterners in the United States in a second, but they're just not big enough to matter to those numbers. So the bottom line is immigration is no fix for an aging society, and if the immigrants are poorer, they can actually make it more difficult for you to fund your government if that's the concern. So we have the projections from the Census Bureau, we have the fertility numbers, and in America, immigration is not a fix to an aging society. I would point out, although I didn't mention Islam, during the Biden years, it looks like the number of Muslim immigrants in the United States likely grew by about 600,000. That's taking into account all the people who left and all the people who came and deaths. That's just the net increase in that. And I bet you that's bigger than France or Great Britain. So Muslim immigration has gotten much bigger in the United States. It's a larger component of the total, but it's still not a huge fraction relative to our other primary sending countries. So.
Thank you, Steve. Nikolai, you talked a lot about, and also you had an excellent report from your organization about Islam in France, and you mentioned the different communities who are coming from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the different parts of Islam who are coming from, because Turkish is following more the Muslim Brotherhood, why it's not so strong in Algeria and Morocco. So what do you think, how do you see, what's the relationship between the certain Muslim sects, religions in France, and what do you think these Muslim communities determine more by their Muslim background or sometimes their political background? I mean, for example, the tension between Morocco and Algeria, and whether do you see that it's imported to France?
Well, I would say, Victor, that the kind of links with the countries of origins you mentioned, they relate to two different kinds of weaponization. The first one is the one I already mentioned, the ones by the countries of origin, once again, Algerian Islam in France, Moroccan Islam in France, Turkish Islam, etc. And the second weaponization is that by Muslim countries which are not actually countries of origin, but we do play the significant role in funding certain types of Islam, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, such as other forms of radical Islam that are not violent for most of them, not in most of the case, but who do have a political agenda that is one of advancing both Islamic rules, practices, and values, betting on demographics, actually betting on the demographic trends I just mentioned. And as regards the second part of your question, it's true that immigration in its current shape and form tends to import many of the conflicts at stake in the countries of origin. The case of Algeria versus Morocco is pretty obvious. You mentioned Turkey. There's also rising tensions in some parts of France between Turkish immigrants and Kurdish immigrants, people who are militant Kurds who support Kurdish independence. There are sometimes riots which take place in Strasbourg or in other cities which tend to have both Turkish immigrants and Kurdish immigrants. And the problem is that this is the kind of weaknesses that can be used by hostile governments in the context of tensions. 4 years ago, there was a peak in tension between France and Turkey because Turkey was getting very aggressive in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea against Greece. Greece, who is of course an historical ally of France, a member of the European Union, etc. So the French Navy and Air Force played a key role in protecting the Greek territorial seas, and there were moments of very high tension with the Turkish military. And at the same time, there were demonstrations taking place in France, taking the stance of Turkey, taking the stance of President Erdogan. And I mean, you do not have to be that foreseeing in order to see that in case of rising tensions, whether internal or external, this is a point of weakness that we never experienced before.
Thank you. Christine, you mentioned how important is the linkage between the nation and the people. And what about the linkage between the nation and the language? Because for me as a European, it's which is very unique for me how the US started to be a multi-language society, just looking around in DC and not only English, but more and more Spanish signs there. So what do you think, how it's affect the nation here?
It's a great question. I looked back at President Trump's executive order on declaring English as the official language a day or two ago, and I was just sort of taken aback, like this should have been obvious to everyone, and it should have been certainly practiced by everyone. But it's something that I think you can see it in Europe now and in certain still parts of the US. If you go to Miami, I feel like you get there and everyone just speaks Spanish to you without even asking. It's kind of awkward, but the sort of, there's no need to understate the sense of like social, I think, community dissonance maybe is the right word, that results from a lack of shared language. It's something that like people I think relate over for good reason, and it's something that causes major issues when you have I have friends that live right outside of London and they walk around their communities, they don't hear English. They go to the store and they can barely speak to the person that's checking them out. And it's something that I think that's the part I was hitting on about how it really impacts people's lives, and so it's causing them to realize that there's something going on. And then when it comes to how America First is viewing this issue too, I think when you think of how a whole country's demographic is shifting, that just inherently means that our relationship as America with, for instance, the UK, that special relationship is going to change because the people now are different, right? And they speak different languages and they have different customs, and there's all this sort of societal, cultural dissonance happening. So I think there's actually huge implications that come from that. I'm glad you asked.
Thank you. Steve, so let's say approximately 2 million illegal aliens left the country in the past months, but there are still, let's say, 13, 14, 15 million. What's your expectation? So the people who wanted to leave already left, or are you expecting more people will return to their countries of origin?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Yogi Berra on this. It's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future, but I would say...
But you're so brilliant, you can.
But I would say that there are two possibilities, right? One is it has a momentum, right? So people are like, wow, I see other people leaving, maybe I'll go. You know, the heck with this Trump guy's crazy. Maybe I'll come back at some point. But you know what? My brother left, I'm going to leave. My brother-in-law says he's going, I think I'll go. You know, so there could be a kind of momentum, or it could have been, if you will, the people least attached, the most recent arrivals, which it probably was, as far as we can tell. It could be people who don't have U.S.-born children. It could be people who were thinking about going home anyway, and so now they just went home a little earlier than they would. Remember, people sometimes always forget, there's a lot of churn in any migrant population, right? People are always coming, but people are always leaving. We used to think that between, I gave you the net migration number, which was somewhere around 1.2 million, but there was probably at least 500,000 people who went home on their own each year. So that number could be higher, maybe more like 750. So what we think is both deportations went up, in-migration went down a lot, and out-migration went out a lot. Will that continue? It's hard to say. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we're going to see more momentum as the enforcement regime unfolds over the next year, or whether that was just the least attached to the United States leaving. And I'm not sure the answer to that question. Neither outcome would surprise me. In other words, the population may not decline too much more, or it might decline much more slowly, or we might see a continuation of a really big decline. We're not sure.
Thank you. Nicola, in the previous panels, you mentioned that sometimes started to happen in Europe, and that, for example, Hungary needs allies to change the legal framework of European asylum and migration system. But from the perspective in Budapest, we don't see anything in France. It's changing in the French politics. Le Pen is there, okay, let's continue her approach, but while there is very obvious shift, for example, in Sweden, it seems that France is reluctant to do anything in this context. Do you expect a change, or what's the explanation for it?
Well, I would say, Victor, that we live in a paradoxical moment in which the French public has never been that opposed to the current levels of immigration, whether you look at every opinion poll that now stems out at least once a month on this topic. You always get between 2/3 and 3/4 of the French who say there is currently too much immigration, and this is an idea that is widely spread in the various electorates. Actually, of course, more than 90% of Le Pen voters would agree with this, but also 2/3 of Macron voters, but also a tiny half of today's left-wing voters. So on one end, there's what seems to be a growing consensus. And on the other end, there has never been as much immigration in France as over the last few years. And I would tend to think that this tension cannot last for long. It is democratically unsustainable. And at some point, immigration will be the decisive theme, the decisive topic on which the most important French elections will be decided. There's still 1 year and a half to go before the next presidential election in France. So, I mean, at this stage, you cannot trust the polls. But what I'm pretty sure of is that immigration will be at the center of all debates. I would tend to agree with you that to have really strong allies and to have the EU change from within, we need either France or Germany to endorse explicitly restrictionist policies. And I would rather bet on France than on Germany on this specific topic. But it might be with Rassemblement National, but it also might be with I would say, some shape of center-right turned more realistic, because center-right politicians are aware that the majority of their electorate is yearning for it. Now they have to find the courage to stand up to both the mainstream media, the judicial deadlock, which is very strong in France, as it was mentioned earlier this morning. So I'm pretty confident that we are on the right track, politically speaking.
Thank you. Christine, if we have a look at the history of the United States, this nation was really forged together or established or created from people with very different cultural backgrounds, from the natives to British, Hungarians, etc. And at least until the last decade, the nation worked. So while we have a look at these multicultural experiments in Western Europe, it's let's say it's a total disaster. So what was the differences, and why it worked in the United States and why it doesn't work in Western Europe?
It's a good question, and I think it hits at a few different factors. The primary one being that the attitudes of the immigrants that came in the early 20th century, for instance, to the US, I think were markedly different than what we're seeing now, because there was a sense of a need or a desire to assimilate and to integrate and to sort of learn the language and be productive members of society. Not to say there weren't issues or anything like that, but now it's a complete 180, I think, with the sort of attitudes of the immigrants coming here, is that they're not respecting our values. They're not immigrating, or they're not integrating, and like in the Europe especially, these sort of parallel societies are forming when you walk through neighborhoods that are just completely distant from the home culture. And I think what's also important, the cultures you just mentioned, for instance, that came to the US previously were mostly from Western nations. And there's, not to say that there's any sort of superiority when it comes to culture, but there is just a fact that the Western nations share a common set of values, and the things that gave us, the culture that gave birth to the ordered liberty that we enjoy today comes from Europe, and it comes from the Catholic Church, it comes from the Christian tradition that spread the faith, and the people that came to the US as immigrants for the first ones were Christian. And so I think that's a very important thing to mention, is when you get these people that are so culturally distant coming to to Europe and the US, but especially in Europe, the Syrian issue, right? And it's a fact that they're not of that same tradition, and they're refusing to respect that tradition. So I think that's the main one. But I also think a certain level of responsibility certainly falls on the governments of our countries, not just letting in all these people, but really not demanding any kind of assimilation or integration or incentivizing it even. I know like Spain, for instance, is gripped with a very striking system of regionalism, where certain local governments have a lot more, I think, incentives in place to encourage migrants to come there and to settle there, and to not really insist on any sort of integration, and others do not. So I know that's an issue in some parts of Europe, but it's really, the consequences can't be understated, because it's leading to all these really intense clashes in neighborhoods and communities. And like I said earlier, ordinary citizens are sort of waking up to this and realizing it's not sustainable.
Can I say something about America? Look, just remember, during the Great Wave, immigration was extremely unpopular for a large segment of the U.S. population. Elites tended to embrace it. But from 1870 to whatever it is, 1924, there is a series of times, like over a dozen, where one or both houses of Congress pass restrictive legislation. Second, we did cut it off. World War I and then 1924 caused the foreign-born to go from roughly 15% of the population all the way down by 1970 to 4.7. So you had more than a half a century of relatively low immigration, which then facilitated assimilation, and all of us are descended. I mean, all of us remember only that period, or those of us who do, tend to recall then the immigration of the past more romantically, but we forget all the disruptions and dissatisfaction. And finally, elite attitudes. You know, in 1915, Justice Brandeis gives this big speech. He says, immigrants don't just have to assimilate. They don't have to just learn our language. They don't have to adopt just our clothes and customs. They need to take on entirely our values and perspectives, and then work with us to perfect our union. So he was himself the child of immigrants. But the point is, there was a very high degree of consensus about assimilation among elites. That's totally broken down in the United States. So one is the numbers. They were low for a long time. Two is the elite attitude matters a whole lot. And three, don't forget that immigration of the past was unpopular in many ways as well, understandably so. There was a concern about job competition and cultural disruptions and so forth.
Okay, well, because I'm afraid of the Wrath of the Titans, including Mark Krikorian, now we close this panel to start the next in time. So thank you very much. Christine, Nicola, Steve.